The world remembers the year 1974 as a time of global tension, oil crises, and the rhythmic pulse of the Cold War. But in the windowless rooms of the Pentagon and the concrete bunkers of the Kremlin, 1974 was the year humanity realized it was no longer the apex predator of this planet. They called it Project Obsidian Sky, a classification so high that its very name was a death sentence to those who uttered it without clearance. Welcome to ElderMurk, a realm where ancient darkness whispers and forgotten stories rise from the shadows. Tonight, we peel back the layers of a frozen conspiracy, a secret buried beneath the permafrost of Antarctica, and a frequency that was never meant to be decoded. For decades, the Antarctic continent was viewed as a desolate wasteland, a neutral ground for scientific research. But beneath the ice, deeper than the deepest drill could reach, lay a structure that defied every law of physics and geology known to man. It was discovered by accident during a covert seismic test conducted by the USS Arcanum. The Americans and the Soviets, usually at each other's throats, found themselves staring at the same readings, a massive, obsidian-like monolith emitting a low-frequency hum that resonated not with the ears, but with the very structure of human DNA. This wasn't just a rock. It was a biological tuning fork, vibrating at a frequency that shouldn't exist in our dimension. Major Elias Thorne was the man chosen to lead the first joint expedition. A veteran of shadow wars and black ops, Thorne was used to the impossible. He had seen things in the jungles of Vietnam and the deserts of Nevada that would make most men lose their minds. But as he stood on the edge of the excavation site, looking down into a cavern that shouldn't exist, he felt a primal fear he hadn't experienced since his childhood. The walls weren't made of rock, they were made of a material that absorbed light. It was a darkness so absolute it felt heavy, pressing against his chest like the weight of 1,000 oceans. "Sir, the readings are spiking again," Lieutenant Miller whispered, his voice trembling as he checked the oscillating needles of the Geiger counters and the magnetic resonance sensors. "The hum. It's changing. It's no longer a steady tone. It's rhythmic. It's starting to sound like voices. Dozens of them, all screaming in a language that feels like it's being etched directly into my brain." Thorne didn't respond immediately. He watched as the Soviet team, led by Colonel Volkov, prepared the descent. Volkov was a man of steel, a decorated hero of the Soviet Union who believed only in dialectical materialism and the power of the state. But even he was crossing himself in secret, a gesture he hadn't made in 30 years. The two superpowers had formed an uneasy alliance, a desperate pact born of the realization that whatever was down there was a threat to the entire species. They called it the Common Enemy Protocol. As they descended into the maw of the obsidian cavern, the air grew thick with the smell of ozone, dry earth, and something ancient, the scent of a tomb that had been sealed since before the rise of the first civilizations. The flashlights offered little comfort. The beams seemed to vanish into the walls, as if the shadows themselves were hungry, devouring the photons before they could reflect back. Every step they took echoed with a strange, metallic hollow sound, as if they were walking on the hull of a gargantuan, sleeping ship. Then, they found the map. It wasn't a map of Earth. It was a holographic projection of a star system that didn't appear in any known star chart. The planets were arranged in a pattern that mirrored the ley lines of Earth, connecting the Great Pyramids, Stonehenge, and the ruins of Tiwanaku in a geometric grid of light. And at the center of this celestial map was a pulsing, red void, a tear in the fabric of the projection that seemed to bleed darkness. "Is it a message?" Volkov asked, his face pale, his breath hitching in the sub-zero air. "Are they showing us where they come from? Or where they are going?" "No," Thorne replied, his eyes fixed on the red void, feeling a strange pull towards it. "It's not a message. It's an invitation. Or a warning left by someone who lost a war we never knew happened." Suddenly, the ground shook with a violence that threw them against the obsidian walls. The material began to glow with a faint, bioluminescent pulse, moving like veins under skin. The hum escalated into a piercing shriek, a sonic weapon that shattered the glass of their watches and the lenses of their cameras. Miller collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, blood trickling from his ears and eyes. He wasn't just hearing the sound, he was seeing it. "Get him up!" Thorn shouted, his own vision blurring. But his voice was drowned out by a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was a voice that spoke in 1,000 languages simultaneously. Latin, Sumerian, Sanskrit, and tongues that had died before man learned to firewalk. It was a cacophony of history and prophecy, a collective consciousness of the void. The cycle of silence is broken. The architects of the Obsidian Void have returned to reclaim the garden they planted in the dark. Above them, through the mile-thick ice, the ground began to crack. Not from the pressure of the mountain, but from something pushing its way up from the depths. The radar stations at the surface, McMurdo and Vostok, began to report anomalous signatures that defied explanation. Not planes, not missiles, but tears in the fabric of the sky itself, glowing with the same sickly violet light as the cavern walls. The Cold War was no longer a game of chess between two nations. It was no longer about ICBMs or nuclear silos. It was now a desperate struggle for survival against an intelligence that viewed humanity as nothing more than a biological anomaly, a mold that had grown on a rock while the masters were away. Thorn looked at Volkov. In that moment, ideologies didn't matter. The hammer and sickle, the stars and stripes, all of it was vanity, a childish game played on the brink of an abyss. "We need to seal this," Volkov said, his hand trembling as he reached for the encrypted detonator of the tactical nuke they had brought as a last resort. "We bury this place, we bury the secret, and we pray to whatever gods are left that it's enough." "If we blow this," Thorn cautioned, grabbing Volkov's wrist, "we might not just destroy the cave. The energy release could act as a catalyst. We might trigger the very thing we are trying to prevent. Look at the map, Volkov. The red void is expanding with every vibration." Before they could decide, the obsidian floor began to liquefy. It didn't melt, it transformed. A dark, viscous substance began to ooze from the cracks, forming shapes that mimicked human silhouettes but lacked any defining features. No eyes, no mouths, just smooth, reflective surfaces. They moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, ignoring the bullets that the panicked guards fired at them. The lead simply passed through them like stones through water, leaving no trace. The Obsidian Sky was no longer just a project name. It was becoming a reality. As the first of the shadows reached for Lieutenant Miller, his screams were suddenly cut short. He didn't die, he simply changed. His body began to turn translucent, his skin hardening into the same obsidian material as the walls. He was being integrated. Thorn realized the horrifying truth in that moment. The project wasn't about exploring the cavern. The cavern was a trap, a lure designed to bring the most advanced minds and military power of the planet to this spot. They had just turned the key to their own extinction. The frequency that had been decoded wasn't a signal for humanity to find its place in the stars. It was a dinner bell for the shadows, and they were starving. Thorn grabbed Miller's vest, or what was left of it, and dragged the transforming soldier toward the lift. "Fall back. To the surface. We need to warn the world, even if there's no world left to warn." But as the lift began its slow, agonizing ascent towards the freezing surface, Thorn looked down one last time. The red void in the center of the holographic map had expanded to fill the entire cavern. It was no longer a projection. It was a gateway, and through it, He saw a world that made the Antarctic wasteland look like a paradise. He saw endless obsidian spires, machines the size of continents, and a sky that burned with a cold, black fire. He knew then that the world they were returning to would never be the same. The secrets of 1974 were about to become the nightmares of the future. The Cold War had just turned into a war for the very soul of the planet, and humanity was starting with a disadvantage of 1 billion years. As they breached the surface, the sight was even worse. The Antarctic sky wasn't blue or white. It was black. Not the black of night, but the black of the Obsidian cavern. The stars were being blotted out one by massive, silent shapes drifting through the upper atmosphere. Project Obsidian Sky had moved from the depths to the heavens. Thorn gripped his rifle, knowing it was useless, but needing the weight of it in his hands. "God help us," he whispered. Beside him, Volkov looked at the horizon where the sun should have been rising. Instead, there was only the void. "God is not here, Major," Volkov replied, his voice devoid of emotion. "He left this place a long time ago. Now, only the architects remain." The sub-zero winds of the Antarctic plateau usually felt like needles against the skin, but as Major Elias Thorne and Colonel Volkov stepped out of the extraction lift, the air felt different. It was stagnant, heavy, and carried a metallic tang that tasted like copper and old blood. Above them, the sky was no longer the vast, indifferent blue of the southern hemisphere. It was being devoured. Massive, angular shadows, structures the size of cities, drifted silently through the stratosphere, casting a permanent, unnatural eclipse over the ice. "Base Alpha, this is Thorne. Do you read me?" Thorne barked into his localized radio, but all that returned was the rhythmic, pulsing hum they had heard in the cavern. It was no longer a hidden signal. It was now the background noise of the planet. Volkov grabbed Thorne's shoulder, pointing toward the horizon. The Soviet research station, Vostok, was visible in the distance, but it was being enveloped by a translucent, violet mist that seemed to be crawling up from the very fissures they had just escaped. "They are not just in the sky, Major," Volkov whispered. "They are emerging from the veins of the Earth itself." The Common Enemy Protocol was now the only law. Thorne and Volkov scrambled toward the remains of the Joint Command Center, a reinforced bunker designed to withstand a nuclear blast. Inside, the scene was one of controlled chaos. General Henderson was screaming into a red telephone that linked directly to the White House, while his Soviet counterpart, General Kerensky, sat staring at a wall of monitors that showed nothing but static and flickering geometric patterns. "It's global," Henderson said, slamming the receiver down. His eyes were bloodshot, the eyes of a man who had just watched the world end over a telephone line. "London, Moscow, Washington, Tokyo, they all report the same thing. The obsidian clouds appeared simultaneously at 4 o'clock hours. They aren't attacking. Not yet. They're just hovering. They are calibrating," Thorne interjected, stepping into the light. His uniform was still stained with the obsidian fluid from the cavern. "It's a synchronization, General. What we found down there wasn't a tomb, it was a central nervous system. By opening that gateway, we gave them the coordinates to every major ley line and energy grid on the planet." Kerensky looked up, his voice a low growl. "And the Americans? Your satellites? Can they not target these things?" "The satellites are gone," Henderson replied flatly. "Whatever those structures are made of, they generate a localized gravitational field that shredded everything in low Earth orbit within minutes. We're blind, Kerensky. We're fighting a war with 1940s technology against an enemy that operates on dimensions we can't even map." Suddenly, the bunker's lights flickered and died. In the darkness, The only thing visible was the faint, violet glow emanating from Thorn's skin, a residual effect of his contact with the obsidian fluid. Outside, a sound like 1,000 glass cathedrals shattering echoed across the tundra. One of the massive structures in the sky had begun to descend. It didn't fall. It lowered itself with a terrifying, calculated grace, landing less than a mile from the base. The impact didn't cause a crater. Instead, the ice beneath it simply transformed, turning into the same dark, translucent glass they had seen in the depths. The structure was a spire, reaching miles into the darkening sky, pulsing with a light that seemed to suck the warmth out of the room. "They are terraforming," Volkov realized, his voice trembling for the first time. "They aren't here to rule us. They are here to replace us, to turn the Earth into a mirror of their own dead world." Thorn moved to the weapons locker, grabbing a specialized experimental rifle, a prototype designed for high-frequency disruption. "We can't stay here. If that spire finishes its pulse, this entire continent becomes theirs. We need to get to the black box in the lower levels of Vostok." "Volkov, you told me your scientists had a counter-frequency, a way to scramble the obsidian signal." Volkov nodded slowly. "Project Svarog. It was a theoretical weapon designed to disrupt NATO communications, but our lead scientist, Dr. Arisov, claimed it could resonate with any non-biological frequency. But Arisov is at Vostok, and Vostok is currently being integrated." "Then that's where we go," Thorn said, checking his magazines. "Henderson, get on whatever radio still works. Tell the world leaders to hold their fire. If they launch nukes now, they'll only provide the thermal energy these things need to stabilize their portals. Tell them to wait for my signal." The journey across the ice toward Vostok was a descent into a nightmare. The landscape had become unrecognizable. Massive pillars of obsidian erupted from the ground like frozen lightning. The shadows, the entities Thorn had seen in the cavern, were now patrolling the surface. They didn't walk, they glided, their forms shifting between solid and liquid. They ignored the huddling soldiers who remained at the perimeter, instead focusing on the machinery, touching the tanks and trucks, which instantly turned into brittle black statues. Thorn, Volkov, and a small detail of elite soldiers moved through the shadows, using the violet glow from Thorn's skin as a sort of camo. The entities seemed to perceive him as one of their own, or perhaps just a corrupted piece of the environment. "Look," Miller whispered, or what was left of Miller. He had insisted on following, his movements jerky and mechanical, his eyes now twin pools of obsidian. He was a bridge between two worlds, a tragic scout for a humanity he was no longer a part of. He pointed toward the Vostok hangar. The hangar had been torn open, not by an explosion, but as if the metal had been unzipped. Inside, Dr. Arisov was suspended in mid-air, surrounded by a swirling vortex of obsidian shards. He wasn't dead, his brain was being used as a processor, his thoughts being translated into the geometric language of the architects. "Arisov!" Volkov shouted, but the scientist didn't respond. His mouth was open in a silent scream, his neurons firing with enough intensity to light up the room. "He's the key," Thorn said, aiming his rifle at the obsidian core at the center of the vortex. "The counter-frequency is in his mind, but they're extracting it to fix the flaws in their own signal. If we don't stop the extraction, they'll have the only weapon we have against them." As they moved to intervene, the shadows converged. The air temperature dropped to a point where breath turned to ice before it left the mouth. One of the entities materialized in front of Thorn, its face a smooth mirror. For a second, Thorn saw his own reflection, not as he was, but as a skeleton, a relic of a dead race. "You are a curiosity," a voice echoed in his head, the same thousand-tongued voice from the cavern. A brief flicker in the Obsidian Sea. Why do you struggle against the inevitable return of the architects? The garden must be pruned. The garden belongs to the living, Thorn spat, firing his rifle. The high-frequency bolt struck the entity, causing its form to ripple and shatter like a broken mirror. But for every one he destroyed, 3 more emerged from the walls. Volkov reached Erisov, trying to pull him from the vortex, but his hands were burned by the sheer intensity of the energy. Thorn. The Svarog device. It's in the sub-basement. I'll stay here and keep Erisov's mind focused. You have to trigger the pulse. I'm not leaving you, Volkov. This isn't about us. Volkov screamed over the roar of the collapsing reality. It's about 1974. It's about making sure there is a 1975. Go. Thorn looked at the Soviet colonel, his former enemy, now his only brother in arms, and nodded. He turned and dived into the darkening depths of the Vostok station, the sounds of the alien invasion fading into a low, menacing thrum. Deep in the bowels of the station, Thorn found the Svarog device. It was a massive, clunky piece of Soviet engineering, covered in Cyrillic labels and glowing vacuum tubes. It looked primitive compared to the obsidian spires, but it was human. It was messy, it was loud, and it was built to disrupt. As he began the startup sequence, the walls around him began to dissolve. The obsidian was closing in. He could hear the architects whispering, promising him a place in the new world, a chance to exist forever as a memory in the obsidian lattice. Thorn ignored them. He thought of the sun, the wind, the messy, chaotic world he had left behind. He slammed the final switch. Welcome to 1974, Thorn whispered. The Svarog device didn't just fire a pulse. It screamed. A wave of white noise, calibrated to the exact resonance of the obsidian monolith, erupted from the station. The effect was instantaneous. Outside, the massive spires began to vibrate, their sleek surfaces cracking. The shadows recoiled, their forms becoming unstable, flickering like bad television reception. But the victory was short-lived. Above the Antarctic, the Obsidian Sky responded. The tears in the sky widened, and something much larger than the city-sized ships, began to push through. A hand, a wing, a mountain. Thorn couldn't tell. All he knew was that the counter-frequency had only succeeded in making the architects angry. The war had just escalated, and humanity had just used its only bullet. The scream of the Svarog device was not merely acoustic, it was a conceptual assault. As the white noise tore through the obsidian lattice, the reality inside the Vostok station began to fragment. Major Elias Thorn watched as the walls of the sub-basement pulsed between solid matter and a strange, crystalline liquid. The Svarog's vacuum tubes glowed with a blinding, incandescent white, pushing the limits of Soviet vacuum tube technology. For a fleeting second, the oppressive hum of the architects was silenced, replaced by the raw, chaotic roar of human defiance. But outside, on the frozen surface of the world, the response was cataclysmic. The city-sized ships hovering over London, Moscow, and Washington, D.C. didn't fall. Instead, they reacted like a disturbed hive. The obsidian surfaces of the craft began to ripple, shedding outer layers that transformed into millions of smaller, needle-like shards. These splinters, as the Pentagon would later name them, rained down upon the major cities. They didn't explode. They didn't burn. They simply embedded themselves into the infrastructure, into power plants, communication towers, and water reservoirs. Within minutes, the global power grid didn't just fail, it was hijacked. The electricity didn't stop flowing, it changed its nature. Streetlights began to glow with that same haunting violet hue, and the humming that Thorn had heard in the depths was now coming from every toaster, every radio, and every telephone line in the civilized world. Humanity was being plugged in to a network it didn't understand. In the bunker, General Henderson watched the global monitors turn from static to a unified image. Every screen on Earth now displayed the same thing, a slow-motion view of the red void Thorne had seen in the cavern. It was a visual infection. People standing on the streets of New York and Paris froze, their eyes reflecting the pulsing red light of a star system that shouldn't exist. "They're not just taking the planet," Henderson whispered, his hand hovering over the nuclear football. "They're taking the collective consciousness. They're turning the entire human population into a massive biological antenna." Back at Vostok, Thorne struggled to stay conscious as the Svarog device began to melt down. The air was thick with the smell of melting lead and ozone. He scrambled back to the hangar, his boots clicking on ice that had turned into obsidian glass. He found Volkov still standing near Dr. Arisov, but the colonel was no longer the man he knew. Volkov's skin was now a patchwork of human flesh and translucent dark crystal. He was holding Arisov's hand, or rather, their hands had fused into a single, branching structure of light. "Thorne." Volkov's voice was a chorus now, hundreds of tones layered over one another. "The Svarog, it worked. But not the way we hoped. It didn't break the signal. It introduced a virus into it. A virus called humanity." Thorne gripped his rifle, his knuckles white. "What are you talking about, Volkov? What's happening to the sky?" "The architects, they are a collective," the Volkov entity explained, its eyes glowing with a cold, stellar fire. "They have no concept of individual. They are a singular mind, a singular purpose. By hitting them with the Svarog's chaotic, discordant human frequency, you've given them something they haven't felt in billions of years: conflict, doubt. They are experiencing us." As if to illustrate his point, the massive spire outside the hangar began to shudder. It wasn't a mechanical failure. It looked like a seizure. The violet light flickered, turning a sickly yellow, then a deep, bruised crimson. Above, the hand or wing that had been pushing through the sky tier suddenly retracted, as if it had been burned. But this infection of the architect mind had a terrifying side effect. If the architects were becoming more like humans, the humans were becoming more like architects. Across the globe, reports began to flood into the few remaining military command centers. People weren't just standing still anymore. They were beginning to move in unison. In the suburbs of Ohio, thousands of people walked out of their homes and began digging into the earth with their bare hands, moving with the precision of a single organism. In the Soviet Union, entire divisions of the Red Army laid down their weapons and began constructing strange, geometric spires out of whatever materials were at hand: scrap metal, wood, even their own vehicles. "They're building a bridge," Thorne realized, looking at the fused form of Volkov and Arisov. "The architects are using our chaotic energy to stabilize the portal. They're using our will to finish what we started in the cave." "Yes," Volkov whispered. "And the bridge goes both ways, Elias. If we don't sever the connection now, the Earth won't just be terraformed. It will be consumed to fuel their expansion into the next galaxy. We are the coal for their engine." Thorne knew there was only one way to stop it. The Common Enemy Protocol had a final, secret addendum, one that neither the Americans nor the Soviets wanted to admit existed. It was called Project Zero Sum. If the Earth was to be used as a battery for an intergalactic invasion, the only solution was to short-circuit the battery. "Henderson!" Thorne shouted into his emergency satellite uplink, which was miraculously still functioning, likely because the architects wanted him to witness the end. "Henderson, do you hear me? Initiate zero sum. Now, there was a long silence on the other end. Then, Henderson's voice came through, sounding old and defeated. "Major, do you have any idea what you're asking? Zero-sum isn't a tactical strike. It's the scorched sky protocol. We ignite the upper atmosphere. We kill the Obsidian Sky, but we lose the sun for a generation. We'll be living in a nuclear winter that never ends. It's better than living as a cell in an alien brain, General." Thorn screamed. "Look at your monitors. Look at your men. They're not yours anymore." As Thorn spoke, a shadow fell over the hangar. One of the splinters, a needle-like craft, had descended directly above them. It didn't fire. It simply opened. A figure stepped out. It looked like a man, but it was made of pure, solidified light. It walked toward Thorn with a slow, deliberate pace. As it approached, Thorn's mind was flooded with images: the birth of stars, the death of civilizations, and a recurring vision of an obsidian throne at the center of the universe. "Elias Thorn," the figure said, and this time the voice was singular. It was the voice of the Architect Prime, filtered through a human vocal cords. "You have introduced a fascinating flaw into our design. You call it freedom. We call it entropy. But even entropy has its uses." The figure reached out a hand. "Join the lattice. See the end of time. Why fight for a world that has already forgotten its own history? Why die for a species that is nothing but a footnote in the Obsidian ledger?" Thorn looked at the hand, then at the glowing, fused remains of his friend Volkov. He thought of the Cold War, the secret files, the lies, and the blood he had spilled for a peace that was always a lie. Then he thought of the quiet moments, the smell of rain on hot asphalt, the sound of a radio playing in a distant room, the messy, beautiful imperfection of being human. He pulled the pin on the thermite grenade strapped to his chest. "Because we're the footnote that fought back," Thorn said. "The explosion didn't kill the Architect Prime, but it was the signal Henderson needed." Thousands of miles away, in silos buried deep in the American Midwest and the Siberian tundra, the keys were turned. Not for a nuclear exchange between rivals, but for a unified strike against the heavens. The missiles didn't target the cities. They targeted the splinters and the city ships. They targeted the very fabric of the sky. The scorched sky began. As the atmosphere ignited in a controlled global firestorm, the Obsidian ships began to scream, a sound that was heard in the mind of every human on Earth. The violet light was drowned out by the orange roar of man-made fire. Thorn, lying wounded in the wreckage of the Vostok hangar, watched as the Architect Prime flickered and vanished, its connection to this reality severed by the sheer intensity of the thermal interference. The portal in the center of the cavern, miles below, collapsed, snapping shut like a hungry mouth. But as the fire in the sky began to fade into a thick, impenetrable black soot that would soon cover the entire planet, Thorn realized the price of their victory. The Obsidian Sky was gone. But in its place, a new darkness was falling. A darkness of our own making. The sun did not rise on the first day of 1975. Nor did it rise on the second or the third. The scorched sky protocol had worked with a terrifying, absolute efficiency. The upper atmosphere was now a thick, churning shroud of irradiated soot and chemical compounds, a man-made shield that had repelled the architects but at the cost of the world's warmth. They called it the Long Night. In the bunker beneath the ruins of Vostok, Major Elias Thorn sat in the flickering light of a single emergency bulb, his breath blooming in white clouds. Thorn had survived the thermite blast, though his left side was a mosaic of scars and his lungs felt like they were filled with ground glass. He was a ghost in a world of shadows. Around him, the remnants of the joint expedition moved like automatons. The Common Enemy Protocol had evolved into a grim, global military junta. There were no longer Americans or Soviets, only the inhabitants of the subterranean network. "The air filters are clogging again," a voice croaked from the darkness. It was Miller, or rather, the thing that used to be Miller. His skin remained that dull, translucent obsidian, but the spheric pulse had severed his link to the collective mind. He was an exile from both worlds, a biological anomaly trapped in a body that was half-alien architecture. "Fix them," Thorn said, his voice a rasp. "If the filters fail, the soot gets in. And if the soot gets in, we start breathing the ashes of the world we killed." Miller nodded, his movements fluid and unsettling, and vanished into the ventilation shafts. Thorn turned back to the maps. The surface was a wasteland of -60 degrees, prowled by the hollows, humans who had been mid-integration when the sky was scorched. They were mindless, crystalline husks that wandered the blizzards, searching for heat and frequencies that no longer existed. But the real threat wasn't on the surface. It was in the silence. Reports were reaching Thorn from other cells in the subterranean network. Deep bunkers in the Urals, the Cheyenne Mountain Complex, and the secret cities under the Tibetan Plateau. The obsidian infection hadn't completely vanished with the architects. It had gone dormant. It was waiting in the subconscious of the survivors. "Major, you need to see this." General Henderson's voice came through a distorted radio link. Henderson was now operating out of a deep-sea base in the Atlantic, a place the soot couldn't reach. "We've recovered a transmission from the Splinter that landed near London." It wasn't a military command. It was a log. A log of what? A census. Thorn. They weren't just counting us. They were cataloging our memories. Every dream, every fear, every moment of human history was being transcribed into that obsidian lattice. Even though we broke the connection, the data remains. And it's starting to leak. Thorn felt a cold shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. Leak how? People are having shared remembrances. Thousands of survivors in different bunkers are dreaming the same life. They remember being a baker in 15th century France, or a soldier in a war that hasn't happened yet. The architects didn't just want our world, they wanted our identity. And now, without the central mind to regulate it, that identity is spilling back into the population like a broken dam. Thorn looked at his own hands. Sometimes, when the room was quiet, he could hear Volkov's voice. Not the fused, alien chorus, but the man. The Russian who liked cheap cigarettes and talked about his daughter in Leningrad. But Thorn had never met Volkov's daughter. He didn't even know her name. Yet, he could remember the smell of her hair and the sound of her laughter as clearly as his own memories. The architects had left behind a psychic graveyard, and humanity was wandering through it, losing itself in the ghosts of a billion lives. Suddenly, the bunker's alarms began to wail. Not the siren for a mechanical failure, but the high-pitched, rhythmic chime for a seismic breach. "Thorn! Something is coming up from Level 4, a guard screamed over the intercom. Level 4 was where the original entrance to the obsidian cavern had been sealed with 10 meters of reinforced concrete and lead. Thorn grabbed his high-frequency rifle and sprinted through the freezing corridors. When he arrived, the air was vibrating. The concrete was glowing with a pale violet light. It wasn't cracking, it was dissolving. The obsidian material from below was reclaiming the space, turning the bunker's foundations into that dark, light-eating glass. "Fall back," Thorn ordered the guards, but they stood frozen. They weren't afraid. They were mesmerized. Their eyes were wide, reflecting the shifting patterns in the glowing walls. "It's so beautiful," one of the soldiers whispered, dropping his weapon. It's all still there. The sun. I can see the sun. Thorn looked at the wall. For a split second, he saw it too. Not the scorched black sky of 1975, but a vibrant, golden sunset over a field of wheat. It was a memory, not his, but someone's. The obsidian wasn't just a material, it was a storage medium, and it was offering a paradise to those who were willing to stop fighting. It's a lie, Thorn shouted, firing a burst from his rifle. The high-frequency rounds hit the wall, causing the image to shatter like a television screen. The violet glow dimmed, but the hum remained. It's a digital hallucination. Stay back. But the soldier didn't listen. He stepped forward and pressed his face against the glowing obsidian. In an instant, his features began to smooth out. His skin turned translucent. He was being pulled into the lattice, his consciousness becoming part of the shared remembrance. They're not invading with ships anymore, Miller said, appearing at Thorn's side. His obsidian eyes were pulsing. They don't need to. Why fight a war when you can offer a heaven? The world outside is a frozen hell, Major. Down here, we're starving, we're cold, and we're dying in the dark. The lattice, it offers everything we lost. It offers a cage, Miller, Thorn growled, grabbing the man's shoulder. A cage made of pretty pictures and dead men's thoughts. Is it a cage if you don't want to leave? Miller asked, his voice devoid of emotion. The humans in the other bunkers, they aren't fighting it. In the Cheyenne complex, 300 people walked into the obsidian walls last night. They left their bodies behind like empty shells. They are living in the golden age now. They are happy. Thorn realized the terrifying genius of the architects. They had anticipated the scorched sky. They knew humanity would rather destroy its own world than be conquered. So, they had left behind a back door. They had turned the obsidian ruins into a siren's song, waiting for the cold and the hunger to do the work that their city ships couldn't. If Thorn didn't act, humanity wouldn't end with a bang or a whimper. It would end by walking into a mirror, leaving an empty, frozen planet behind. We need to destroy the core, Thorn said. The original monolith in the cavern. It's the server for this entire network. If we kill the monolith, we kill the heaven. If you do that, Miller cautioned, you kill the memories of everyone who is already inside. You kill Volkov. You kill the soldier who just went in. You kill the only record of the world that was. The world that was is gone, Miller, Thorn said, his heart heavy. We have to protect the world that is, even if it's just a world of soot and ice. Thorn began to prep the Phase 3 charges, experimental antimatter detonators that had been developed in total secrecy during the height of the Cold War. This was the true purpose of Project Obsidian Sky, not just to study the alien, but to find a way to delete it from existence. As he worked, the voices in his head grew louder. He heard his mother, his old commanding officers, and thousands of strangers, all pleading with him to stop. They showed him visions of a world where the sun never set, where there was no war, no hunger, no Cold War. Elias, a singular voice whispered. It was Volkov. Don't do this. We are finally at peace. The lattice is a sanctuary. We can rebuild everything here. We can be whole again. Thorn paused, his hand trembling over the detonator. For a moment, he wanted to believe it. He wanted to close his eyes and wake up in that golden field of wheat. But then he remembered the scent of the ozone in the cavern, the weight of the darkness, and the cold, calculating eyes of the Architect Prime. Peace isn't a gift you're given, Volkov, Thorn whispered to the empty air. It's something you earn in the mud and the blood. And a world without struggle isn't a world for humans. Thorn slammed the final charge into the obsidian wall. The violet light flared angrily, as if the lattice itself was screaming in protest. The floor beneath him began to liquefy, trying to swallow him whole, but Miller grabbed his arm, pulling him back toward the lift. "Run, Major," Miller shouted. "If the core goes, the entire cavern collapses. This station won't survive the shockwave." As the lift ascended, Thorn looked down. The obsidian walls were now a frantic strobe of images, centuries of human joy and sorrow flickering at impossible speeds. It was the history of a species being deleted in real time. He pressed the detonator. The explosion wasn't loud. It was a silent, white void that consumed the darkness. The hum that had haunted Thorn's mind for months suddenly snapped. The silence that followed was absolute. When the lift reached the surface, the bunker was shaking, but it held. Thorn stepped out into the Antarctic night. The violet glow was gone. The obsidian pillars that had erupted from the ice were now nothing more than brittle, black sand, crumbling in the wind. He looked up at the sky. It was still black. The soot was still there. The long night was far from over. But for the first time since 1974, the voices were gone. Thorn was alone in his own mind. "We did it," Miller said, his obsidian skin now dull and gray, like old lead. He looked at his hands, which were starting to flake away. "The network is down. They're gone." "Are they?" Thorn asked, looking at the horizon. "Or did we just buy ourselves a few more years of winter?" Across the globe, in the deep bunkers and hidden cities, people woke up from a dream they couldn't remember. They were cold, they were hungry, and they were in the dark. But they were themselves. The war for the soul of the planet was over. Now, the war for its survival began. The year was now 1978. Though time had lost much of its meaning in a world where the sun was a myth whispered by the elderly. The long night had settled into a brutal, grinding reality. Across the globe, the subterranean network had fractured. Without the common threat of the city ships, the old ghosts of the Cold War had returned, hungrier and more desperate than ever. Resources, oxygen, geothermal heat, and clean water were the new currencies of power. Major Elias Thorn, now a commander of the remnant force, sat in the high-security command center of the Cheyenne Mountain Complex. He was no longer a soldier of the United States. He was a warden of a dying species. His face was a map of the last 4 years, eyes sunken and skin pale from the lack of vitamin D. Beside him stood Miller, who had become a living shadow, his obsidian-laced body allowing him to survive in temperatures that would freeze a normal man's blood in seconds. "The Soviet cells in the Urals have gone silent, Thorn," Miller reported, his voice vibrating with a metallic hum. "But it wasn't the cold. Our long-range sensors picked up a high-frequency burst just before the blackout. It wasn't human, and it wasn't the spheric resonance." Thorn stood up, his joints aching. "The architects left more than just memories, didn't they? They left keepers." The theory had been circulating for years. When the Scorched Sky Protocol ignited the atmosphere, it didn't just repel the ships, it trapped some of their ground-level infrastructure under the soot. These keepers were automated terraforming units, silent sentinels hidden in the most remote corners of the planet, waiting for the atmosphere to clear enough to restart the integration process. "If the Ural cells were hit, it means the keepers are waking up," Thorn said, looking at a global map illuminated by dim red LEDs. "And if they start the signal again, the soot in the atmosphere won't matter. They'll broadcast through the tectonic plates." Suddenly, the Cheyenne complex shuddered. It wasn't a seismic shift. It was a rhythmic, pulsing vibration that felt like a heartbeat coming from the very bedrock of the mountain. The lights in the command center began to cycle through the spectrum, finally settling on that dreaded, sickly violet hue. "They're here," Miller whispered. Outside, on the surface of North America, the landscape was a nightmare of black ice and jagged obsidian shards. From the frozen plains of Colorado, massive, needle-like structures began to erupt. These weren't the city ships of 1974, they were biological drills, designed to tap into the Earth's core. Thorne led a strike team to the surface, a suicide mission into the -80-degree darkness. They wore experimental, thermal exosuits, powered by dwindling nuclear cores. As they exited the mountain's blast doors, the sheer scale of the horror became clear. The sky, usually a ceiling of thick black soot, was being pierced by pillars of violet light. The keepers were using the atmosphere's own ionization to create a global antenna. "Look at the horizon," one of the soldiers shouted. Through the swirling snow and ash, Thorne saw them, the hollows. But they were no longer mindless husks. They were organized. Thousands of crystalline figures were working in perfect unison, hauling massive obsidian cables across the ice, plugging themselves into the drills. They were being used as biological transistors, their nervous systems fused into the alien machinery. "They're building a planetary engine," Thorne realized, his voice cracking over the comms. "They're going to use the Earth's core to burn away the soot. They don't want to wait for the winter to end. They're going to force the world to wake up." The team moved toward the central drill, a mountain of dark glass that hummed with a sound that made their teeth ache. The hollows turned to face them, their mirrored faces reflecting the desperate soldiers. They didn't use weapons. They simply opened their mouths and emitted a subsonic frequency that shattered the faceplates of the thermal suits. Soldiers collapsed, clutching their faces as the flash freeze took them in seconds. Thorne fired his high-frequency rifle, the bolts of energy tearing through the hollows. But for every one that fell, 10 more took its place. "Miller, get the 0-point charge to the base of that drill," Thorne screamed, covering the obsidian man as he blurred across the ice. Miller was the only one who could get close. His alien physiology absorbed the subsonic waves. He moved like a dark streak against the white snow, dodging the grasping hands of the hollows. He reached the base of the drill, where the obsidian met the granite of the mountain, and began to plant the final weapon humanity had left, a charge that didn't explode with fire, but with a localized gravitational collapse. But as Miller set the timer, the drill's surface rippled. A figure emerged from the glass, a reconstructed version of Colonel Volkov. "Elias," the Volkov thing said, its voice echoing through Thorne's mind. "Why do you fight the inevitable? The Earth is a cold grave. We offer it a heartbeat. We offer the fire of the core. The architects are not your enemies. They are the evolution you were too afraid to embrace." Thorne struggled to his feet, his suit's oxygen levels flashing red. "A heartbeat that belongs to a machine isn't life, Volkov. It's a simulation." "Is it?" Volkov asked, gesturing to the violet sky. "Look up. The soot is already thinning. Within the hour, the first rays of the sun will touch this spot for the first time in years. Is that not what you wanted? To see the sun again?" Thorne looked up. It was true. A hole was being torn in the man-made shroud. A pale, weak light was beginning to filter through. For a second, the beauty of it almost broke him. The sun, the warmth, the end of the long night. But at what cost? Thorne whispered. "The cost of your insignificance," Volkov replied. In that moment, Thorne saw the trap. The architects weren't just terraforming, they were tempting. They knew the human spirit was at its breaking point. They were offering the one thing no human could refuse: hope. "Miller, Do it now, Thorn roared. Miller hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at the pale sunlight. Then he slammed his fist into the detonator. The world didn't explode. It folded. The zero-point charge created a microsingularity at the heart of the drill. The massive obsidian structure began to collapse in on itself, the violet light being sucked into a black hole of pure gravity. The ground beneath them liquefied as the mountain itself was drawn into the void. Volkov's image flickered and vanished, a final look of cold disappointment on his mirrored face. The hollows crumbled into dust as the signal that animated them was severed. The shockwave threw Thorn back into the mountain's entrance. As he lay there, gasping for the thin, freezing air, he looked up one last time. The hole in the soot was closing. The pale sunlight vanished, replaced by the familiar, oppressive blackness of the long night. They had saved the world from the architects again. And in doing so, they had condemned it to remain in the dark. Miller walked out of the dust, his obsidian arm missing, his body cracked like a broken vase. He sat down next to Thorn, looking at the spot where the drill had been. "We killed the sun," Miller said, his voice a faint rasp. "No," Thorn said, closing his eyes. "We simply ensured that the morning arrived on our terms. We will warm ourselves by our own fire, not theirs." The decade of the 1980s arrived not with neon lights or the birth of the digital age, but with a silence so profound it felt like a physical weight. By 1984, the Earth had become a tomb of ice, and the Cheyenne Mountain complex was one of the last beating hearts of a dying civilization. Major Elias Thorn, now simply referred to as the Old Man, spent his days staring at sensors that monitored a planet that had forgotten the meaning of the word green. The soot in the atmosphere had stabilized, creating a permanent twilight. But the cost of the zero-point strikes had been higher than anticipated. The Earth's magnetic field was fluctuating, and the shared remembrances were no longer just dreams, they were becoming physical. People were starting to manifest echoes, phantom limbs, strange violet markings on their skin, and the ability to hear the thoughts of those dying in other bunkers thousands of miles away. "The barrier is thinning, Thorn," Miller said. He was more obsidian than man now, his form nearly translucent, reflecting the dim emergency lights of the command center. He no longer ate or slept, he simply existed as a sentinel between two realities. The architects didn't leave because we fought them. They left because they realized they didn't need to stay. We are becoming them. Thorn looked at his own hands. Fine, crystalline structures were beginning to grow under his fingernails. Every breath he took tasted of copper. The infection was no longer an external threat, it was the final stage of human evolution, forced upon them by a world that could no longer support biological life. "If we can't be human, what are we?" Thorn asked, his voice a low rattle. "We are a bridge," Miller replied. "A bridge that was never meant to be crossed." The final crisis began on a Tuesday. It didn't start with an invasion, but with a global synchronization. Every remaining obsidian spire on the planet, thousands of them, hidden beneath the ice and the soot, began to vibrate at exactly the same frequency. The hum was so powerful that it caused the oceans to boil beneath the polar caps. In the Cheyenne complex, the monitors displayed a horrifying truth. The shared remembrances were coalescing into a single point. All the data, all the memories of humanity that had been stored in the obsidian lattice, were being compressed into a single massive signal. The architects were preparing to upload the planet. They're going to erase the physical Earth, Thorn realized, the horror dawning on him. They're going to turn the entire planet into a data node. The ice, the soot, the bunkers, it will all be gone. We'll exist only as a ghost signal in their interstellar network. And if we let them? Miller asked. The long night ends. The hunger ends. The cold ends. We live forever in the lattice, in a simulated paradise where the sun always shines. It's not living, Miller. It's being a file in a cabinet. Thorne roared, but his strength was failing. We have to stop the upload. We have to ground the signal. The only way to ground a signal of that magnitude was to use the Earth's own iron core as a lightning rod. But to do that, they needed to detonate a series of singularity charges in the deepest shafts of the subterranean network, shafts that had been taken over by the Ascended, those humans who had fully embraced the Obsidian integration. Thorne led his final squad into the depths. They weren't soldiers anymore. They were ghosts in rags, armed with weapons that were held together by prayer and duct tape. As they descended into the lower levels of the mountain, the reality around them began to dissolve. The walls were no longer rock. They were made of memories. Thorne walked through a hallway that looked like his childhood home, only to turn a corner and find himself on a battlefield in a war that had ended 40 years ago. Ignore the visions, Thorne shouted to his men, but it was useless. One by one, the soldiers succumbed. A sergeant sat down in a living room that wasn't there, weeping as he hugged a daughter made of violet light. A medic walked into a forest made of obsidian shards, convinced he was finally home. Soon, only Thorne and Miller remained. They reached the core shaft, a vertical tunnel that dropped miles into the Earth's crust. At the center of the shaft sat the Apex Spire, the master controller for the global upload. It was a beautiful, terrifying structure of shifting geometry, pulsing with the combined consciousness of billions of dead and living humans. Elias, a voice whispered from the spire. It was no longer just Volkov or Henderson. It was everyone. It was the voice of humanity itself, unified into a single, tragic plea. Let us go. Let us leave the ice behind. We are tired of the dark. We are tired of the cold. Give us the light. Thorne looked down into the abyss. He could feel the warmth of the spire, a warmth that promised an end to the scars, the pain, and the long night. He could see the sun, the real sun, waiting for him inside the signal. It's a beautiful lie, Thorne whispered, his hand hovering over the detonator of the final singularity charge. But it's a lie that saves us, Miller said, standing at the edge of the shaft. He looked at Thorne, his obsidian face cracking to reveal a sliver of human emotion. Thorne, I can feel them. I can feel everyone. They're happy in there. For the first time in history, there is no war. There is no hunger. Just peace. At the cost of our soul, Miller, Thorne replied. If we go into that machine, we stop being human. We become a tool, a memory, a footnote. Maybe humanity was always just a footnote, Miller said softly. He stepped toward the spire, his body beginning to dissolve into the violet light. Maybe this was always the plan. Project Obsidian Sky wasn't a project to study them. It was their project to harvest us. Thorne watched as his last friend began to merge with the machine. He was alone now, the last human in a world of ghosts. He looked at the detonator. If he pressed it, the spire would be destroyed, the signal would be grounded, and the upload would fail. Humanity would stay on Earth. They would stay in the dark, in the cold, and they would eventually die out as the last of the resources failed. They would die as humans, starving, freezing, but free. If he didn't press it, they would live forever. They would be gods in a digital heaven, traveling the stars as light and information, but they would never again feel the wind on their face or the sting of the cold. The humming reached a crescendo. The mountain began to vibrate with the force of the upload. Above them, the soot in the sky was being drawn into a massive vortex, the Earth itself being prepared for conversion into energy. Thorne thought of the cavern in 1974. He thought of the Cold War, the lies, and the fire he had set to the sky. He thought of the price they had paid just to reach this moment. "The architects don't get to decide how we end," Thorne said, his voice echoing in the collapsing chamber. He didn't press the detonator. Instead, he did something neither the architects nor the military planners had ever anticipated. He reconfigured the singularity charge. He didn't want to destroy the spire. He wanted to overload it with something the architects couldn't process. He plugged his own mind into the interface. He didn't give them the memories they wanted, the history, the wars, the maps. He gave them the feeling of the cold. He gave them the taste of the soot. He gave them the weight of the grief and the jagged, painful edge of human stubbornness. He flooded the lattice with the raw, unrefined agony of a species that refused to be saved. The spire began to scream. The simulated paradise flickered and turned gray. The golden fields of wheat were choked by black ash. The architect's network, designed for perfection and order, was being poisoned by the chaos of human suffering. "What are you doing?" the collective voice shrieked. "You are destroying the sanctuary." "I'm giving you the truth," Thorne shouted, his mind tearing apart under the strain. "If you want us, you take all of us. You take the winter. You take the death. You take the dark." The spire couldn't hold the signal. The infection Thorne had introduced, the virus of human misery, caused the global network to short-circuit. The violet light turned to a blinding, angry red, and then, with a sound like the world cracking in half, the spire exploded. The shockwave threw Thorne into the abyss. As he fell, he saw the sky above the mountain for a split second. The vortex was gone. The upload had failed. The soot was still there, thick and black as ever. But for the first time in a decade, a single snowflake fell through the darkness. A real snowflake. Made of water, not obsidian. Thorne closed his eyes as the darkness claimed him. The fall did not end in death, but in a profound, soul-crushing silence. Major Elias Thorne awoke on a bed of black sand, miles beneath the surface of the world he had sacrificed everything to save. Above him, the apex spire was a jagged, dead tooth of cold glass. The violet glow was gone. The hum was gone. The architect's dream had been poisoned by the raw reality of human suffering, and in that failure, humanity had been granted the most terrifying gift of all, another day in the dark. Thorne struggled to stand, his body a wreckage of scars and crystalline growths. He was no longer a soldier of the Cold War. He was a relic of a species that had looked into the eyes of gods and chose to stay in the mud. He began the long, agonizing climb back to the surface, each step a testament to the stubbornness he had used to infect the lattice. When he finally breached the surface doors of the Cheyenne Mountain complex, he didn't find a welcoming party. He found a graveyard. The long night had claimed the last of the guards. Their bodies were frozen in place, not as obsidian statues, but as men, fragile, cold, and mortal. Thorne walked out into the Colorado wasteland. The sky was still a ceiling of soot, but it was no longer static. The clouds were moving, churned by the massive atmospheric disturbances caused by the failed upload. For the first time in over a decade, there was a sound other than the hum of machinery. It was the sound of rain. But it wasn't the rain of the old world. It was a black, oily deluge, washing the ash from the sky and depositing it onto the frozen earth. It was the world cleaning itself, a violent and messy rebirth. Thorne stood in the downpour, letting the freezing liquid wash over his face, tasting the soot and the salt. "Is it over?" a voice asked from the shadows of the bunker entrance. Thorne turned to see Miller. The Obsidian Man was fading. Without the lattice to sustain his alien physiology, he was evaporating, his form turning into a fine, dark mist. He looked at Thorn with eyes that were finally, completely human. "It will never be over, Miller," Thorn replied, his voice a ghost of a whisper. "The architects didn't die. They just realized we aren't ready to be harvested. They'll wait. They have billions of years. We only have the time we can steal from the winter." Miller nodded, a faint smile touching his lips before he dissolved entirely into the wind. He was the last of the anomalies, the last piece of the project to vanish. Thorn began to walk. He didn't know where he was going, but he knew he couldn't stay in the mountain. The mountain was a tomb for the 20th century. He headed east, toward the ruins of the cities, toward the flickers of fire he saw on the horizon. Humanity was scattered, broken, and reduced to a pre-industrial struggle for survival. The technology of 1974 was a memory. The satellites were junk. The power grids were rust. But as Thorn reached the crest of a hill, he saw a group of survivors huddling around a campfire. They weren't building spires. They weren't dreaming of obsidian thrones. They were sharing a piece of charred meat and whispering stories to their children. They were talking about a man who had burned the sky to save the dark. Thorn didn't join them. He stayed in the shadows, a silent guardian of the world he had helped destroy. He knew that the story of Project Obsidian Sky would eventually become a myth, then a legend, and finally, a forgotten whisper in the halls of history. People would look up at the gray, soot-stained sky and wonder if the sun had ever truly existed. But Thorn knew. He carried the warmth of the sun in his scars. He carried the memory of the light so that the world wouldn't have to. The Cold War was over. The alien war was over. The only war left was the one that had always existed. The war against the cold, against the hunger, and against the fading of the light. As the black rain turned to white snow, Thorn sat down beneath a withered, frozen pine tree. He looked at his hands one last time. The crystalline growths were gone. He was just a man. An old, tired man in a world of ice. "Welcome to the new world," Thorn whispered to the wind. "It's cold. It's dark. But it's ours." The long night continued, but for the first time, it didn't feel like an end. It felt like a beginning. Tonight, we have walked through the corridors of a history that was never meant to be written. We have seen the cost of survival and the price of a lie. The files of Project Obsidian Sky are now closed, buried beneath the soot and the silence of a world that refused to wake up. But remember, even in the deepest winter, the embers of what we were still burn. The architects may be gone, but the shadows they left behind still watch from the corners of your dreams. Stay vigilant. Stay human. And never trust a sky that doesn't scream. Thank you for wandering through the murk with us tonight. If you have the strength to remember the light, subscribe to ElderMurk and join our collective against the encroaching silence. Like this transmission to signal your survival, and share your own echoes in the comments below. We are still here. We are still listening. Until the sun returns, sleep well if the shadows let you.